The GSF pinnacle of administrative excellence represented everything the Galactic Security Federation valued most: order, procedure, and the sort of obsessive attention to detail that would make a neurotic accountant weep with joy. At precisely 0800 hours, Galactic Standard Time, the ship's weekly weapons inventory commenced with all the enthusiasm of a funeral march and twice the paperwork. Commander Yaxis of the Rigid Spine Collective stood at attention in the armory, his forearms crossed in what his species considered the universal gesture of deeply concerned authority figure. His subordinates scurried about with scanning devices, clipboards, and that particular brand of nervous energy that only comes from knowing that one misplaced laser rifle could result in 17 different tribunals. The armory itself was a testament to bureaucratic perfection. Every weapon had its designated mounting point, color-coded by threat level, serial numbered in triplicate, and positioned according to the Galactic Weapons Storage Protocol revision. The fact that this made accessing anything in an emergency roughly as efficient as performing surgery with oven mitts was apparently beside the point. Lieutenant Bex of the punctual cephalopods approached with a clipboard that seemed to have evolved its own gravitational field from the sheer weight of documentation. "Sir, we've completed sections Alpha through Gamma 7. Everything is precisely where the regulations dictate it should be." "Excellent," Commander Yaxis replied, which in his species' throat-clicking language sounded like a satisfied filing cabinet. "And our human engineer?" "Ah, yes, the human." The newest addition to their crew had been assigned to armory maintenance 3 weeks prior, much to everyone's barely concealed horror. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy for what diplomatic circles politely termed creative problem-solving, and what everyone else called terrifying disregard for proper procedure. As if summoned by their collective anxiety, the human in question rounded the corner, toolkit in hand, whistling something that probably violated at least 6 noise ordinances. She moved with that peculiar human confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, even when what she was doing made no sense to anyone else. "Morning, Commander," she said, offering a casual salute that was technically correct but somehow managed to convey the impression that military formality was more of a polite suggestion than an absolute requirement. Commander Yaxis's throat-clicking intensified. "Engineer, report to Lieutenant Bex for inventory verification." What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones throughout the Galactic Fleet for years to come. As the human approached, Lieutenant Bex's scanning device began emitting a sound that could best be described as the electronic equivalent of a panic attack. The readings were impossible. According to the scanner, she was carrying enough explosive material to redecorate several deck levels in a distinctly abstract fashion. "Halt!" Lieutenant Bex's tentacles writhed with alarm. "The scanner indicates you're carrying unauthorized ordnance." The human paused, looked down at her toolkit, and shrugged with the sort of casual indifference that made safety inspectors throughout the galaxy develop stress disorders. "Oh, that. Yeah, it's just the thermal grenade." The armory fell silent except for the soft whimpering of Ensign Gleep, whose nervous system had evolved specifically to detect potential explosions from 3 solar systems away. Commander Yaxis felt all 4 of his stomachs drop into his boots, which was both physiologically uncomfortable and entirely against regulation. "Just the thermal grenade," he managed, his voice achieving frequencies that made the walls vibrate sympathetically. The human opened her toolkit with the casual ease of someone revealing a sandwich rather than military-grade explosives. "Mark 7 thermal grenade, fully armed, standard issue. Don't worry, the safeties." Lieutenant Bex's clipboard fell to the floor, its bureaucratic weight making a sound like the death knell of proper procedure. "Safety's on." "Well, mostly on. These older models can be a bit finicky." Commander Yaxis felt his career flashing before his eyes, which was particularly disturbing since his species experienced time in a non-linear fashion. "Engineer," he said, his voice climbing to octaves that only dolphins and very concerned commanding officers could achieve, "would you care to explain why you are casually carrying a live thermal grenade in your personal toolkit?" The human looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if he'd asked her why she kept oxygen in her lungs or why she insisted on maintaining a heartbeat. She glanced at the grenade, then at the armory's pristinely organized weapon displays, then back at the commander with an expression of patient explanation. "Well, sir," she said, with the tone of someone stating the blindingly obvious, it wouldn't fit in the Armory. To understand how the Galactic Security Federation had arrived at this particular moment of cosmic absurdity, one would need to travel back 3 weeks, to the day when the human engineer first laid eyes on what the ship's manifest proudly described as the most advanced weapons storage facility in galactic history. The Armory had been designed by the perfectionist collective of Zephyr Prime, a species whose entire evolutionary history had been dedicated to the pursuit of aesthetic excellence and mathematical beauty. Their homeworld was famous throughout the galaxy for architecture so stunning that tourists regularly walked into walls while gawking at the scenery. The fact that most of these buildings were completely unusable for their intended purposes was considered a minor quibble by beings who valued form over function with religious fervor. The Armory was, by any objective measure, breathtakingly beautiful. Every weapon mount was positioned according to principles of golden ratio mathematics. The color scheme flowed through 17 different harmonic progressions. The lighting created shadows that formed pleasing geometric patterns at precisely 0900 hours each day, when the artificial gravity field hit its peak efficiency cycle. It was also, from a practical standpoint, the most monumentally stupid weapons storage system ever conceived by sentient beings. The human had realized this approximately 37 seconds after her first shift began. The Armory's storage matrix had been calculated to accommodate exactly 2,847 standard weapons of varying classifications, arranged in perfect mathematical harmony. Adding or removing even one item would disrupt what the Zephyrians called the cosmic balance of arsenal aesthetics. This presented a problem when the human discovered that the inventory manifest listed 2,000 Mark 7 model standard issue for human engineers, required for emergency bulkhead clearing operations. According to Regulation 1847 subsection 94, according to the Armory's design specifications, adding one more weapon would create what the Zephyrians termed harmonious disruption cascade failure. The human had done what humans typically did when faced with contradictory bureaucratic requirements. She had attempted to file the proper paperwork to fix the obvious problem. This had been a mistake of galactic proportion. Form 847B, Request for Armory Configuration Modification, required approval from the Weapons Safety Committee, the Aesthetic Standards Board, the Zephyrian Cultural Preservation Society, and the Department of Harmonious Military Application. Each department insisted that the other three had primary jurisdiction. The Weapons Safety Committee argued that aesthetic considerations fell outside their purview. The Aesthetic Standards Board maintained that they couldn't evaluate safety implications. The Cultural Preservation Society claimed that any modifications to Zephyrian design principles required a full anthropological impact study. The Department of Harmonious Military Applications had apparently been dissolved 3 years earlier, but nobody had bothered to update the form. Meanwhile, the grenade couldn't be left unattended in her quarters, as that would violate Storage Protocol 18, and it couldn't be transferred to another ship without initiating an inter-vessel weapons exchange protocol that would take approximately 6 months to process. So the human had done what humans do when bureaucracy fails to accommodate reality. She had adapted. The grenade became her constant companion during daily maintenance rounds. She carried it in her toolkit while repairing atmospheric processors, tucked it into her utility belt while calibrating artificial gravity generators, and occasionally used it as a paperweight while filling out the endless forms requesting permission to store it properly. The alien crew members' reactions had evolved through several distinct phases. Initial terror gave way to nervous fascination, which gradually transformed into a sort of morbid admiration for the human's casual relationship with military-grade explosives. Ensign Gleep had developed a nervous tic that caused him to flee whenever he spotted the human approaching with her toolkit. Lieutenant Bex had started taking alternate routes through the ship to avoid what she termed the walking violation of everything sacred about proper procedure. Commander Yaxis had initially assumed the situation would resolve itself through proper channels. This was before he learned that proper channels in the Galactic Security Federation had evolved into a labyrinthine network of interdepartmental committees, each dedicated to ensuring that no decision could ever be made without consulting at least 17 other departments, who would inevitably insist that they lacked authority to make decisions. The human, meanwhile, had integrated the grenade into her daily routine with the sort of practical acceptance that made safety inspectors throughout the galaxy question their career choices. She had even given it a nickname, though she refused to share what it was, claiming that some relationships are too personal for public consumption. By the third week, the grenade had become something of a ship mascot. Crew members would ask about its well-being. The ship's AI had begun including it in daily personnel reports. The galley's staff had started setting aside a small portion of synthetic nutrients for it, despite multiple explanations that grenades did not require feeding. Commander Yaxis had reached the point where he was seriously considering early retirement, when the weekly inventory finally forced the issue into the open. As he stood there in the armory, staring at his human engineer and her casual explanation of why she carried military explosives like a pocket calculator, he felt the weight of galactic bureaucracy pressing down on his exoskeleton like a moon-sized filing cabinet. What Commander Yaxis didn't know, as he contemplated the heat death of his military career, was that at that precise moment, similar scenes were playing out across 17 different vessels in the Galactic Security Federation fleet. The revelation came courtesy of Lieutenant Bex's frantic communication to Fleet Command, which triggered what would later be known in military history as the Great Human Improvisation Crisis. The first report arrived from the GSF Bureaucratic Perfection, where maintenance discovered that their human technician had been using a disruptor rifle as a particularly effective pipe wrench. When questioned, the human explained that the engineering toolkit provided by Supply Command was missing a 47mm hydrocoupling wrench, and the disruptor's emitter array was exactly the right size. The weapon worked perfectly for the purpose, was always available since it couldn't fit in the aesthetically balanced weapons locker, and had the added benefit of being able to clear stubborn blockages with a low-power pulse. From the GSF Harmonious Compliance came word that their human communications officer had rewired the ship's announcement system to bypass the approved message protocol database. Instead of requiring 6 hours of committee approval for each announcement, messages could now be broadcast immediately in case of emergencies. The human had apparently grown tired of watching crew members suffocate while waiting for permission to announce atmospheric system failure. The GSF Perfect Procedural Adherence reported that their human pilot had disabled the automated flight path verification system, which required confirmation from the navigation authority before making any course correction. The system was apparently designed to prevent unauthorized deviations from approved routes, which was admirable in principle but proved problematic when avoiding asteroids, enemy fire, or other objects that had inconsiderately placed themselves in approved flight paths without proper authorization. As the reports continued to pour in, a disturbing pattern emerged. Humans throughout the fleet had been quietly, systematically, and with terrifying efficiency, fixing problems that the rest of the galaxy had simply accepted as inevitable features of advanced civilization. Admiral Tenthrax of the Meticulous Planning Confederation called an emergency session of the Fleet Command Council. The assembled representatives of various galactic species reviewed the reports with the sort of horrified fascination normally reserved for natural disasters or experimental cuisine. "Let me understand this correctly," Admiral Tenthrax said, his tentacles twitching with the nervous energy of someone whose entire worldview was being systematically demolished. "The humans have been ignoring regulation." "Not ignoring, sir," corrected Commander Yaxis, who had been hastily summoned to explain his ship's contribution to the crisis. "They appear to be following the spirit of the regulations while completely disregarding the specific procedural requirements." This concept was so alien to the assembled officers that several species required emergency breathing assistance. The Rigid Spine Collective had evolved specifically to follow procedures with mathematical precision. The punctual cephalopods considered deviation from established protocols to be a form of mental illness. The idea that someone could achieve regulatory compliance while ignoring regulations was like suggesting that someone could be simultaneously dead and alive, which ironically, humans had also claimed was possible in something called quantum mechanics. "But how do they maintain safety standards without proper oversight committees?" asked General Clipboard of the Administrative Zealots, whose species had elevated bureaucracy to an art form roughly equivalent to performance dance. Commander Yaxis consulted his notes, which had grown to the size of a small novel during the past 3 hours of testimony. "According to our human engineer, they use something called common sense." The council chamber fell silent except for the sound of various species trying to process this information through cognitive frameworks that had no existing category for such a concept. Common sense, as the humans apparently understood it, involved making decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than consulting comprehensive databases of pre-approved responses to hypothetical situations. "Sir," Lieutenant Bex interjected from the communication station, "we're receiving reports from civilian vessels as well. Apparently human merchants have been completing trade negotiations in hours rather than the standard 6-month approval process. Human medical officers are treating patients immediately instead of waiting for the Medical Ethics Verification Board to approve each procedure. Human engineers are repairing systems when they break rather than filing malfunction reports and waiting for authorized repair technicians to arrive." The implications were staggering. If humans could achieve the same results as established galactic procedures while ignoring most of the actual procedures, what did that say about the procedures themselves? The question hung in the air like a philosophical weapon of mass destruction. Admiral Tenthrax turned to Commander Yaxis with the desperate expression of someone clinging to the last vestiges of a collapsing worldview. "Commander, ask your human engineer to explain exactly why she felt authorized to make these decisions without proper oversight." The communication link crackled to life, displaying the human engineer in the Armory, where she was now calmly explaining to a group of fascinated alien crew members how the thermal grenade could theoretically be used to open stuck storage compartments, clear blocked ventilation shafts, or create emergency exit routes. The aliens were taking notes with the intensity of graduate students attending a lecture by a particularly brilliant but slightly unhinged professor. "Engineer Commander Yaxis," said, his voice carrying across space with the weight of galactic bureaucracy behind it. "Fleet Command would like to understand your decision-making process." The human looked up from her impromptu demolition seminar with the expression of someone who had been asked to explain why water was wet. "Well, sir, things needed fixing, and I know how to fix them. The regulations were preventing the fixing, so I found ways to do the fixing that didn't technically violate the regulations. Seemed pretty straightforward. But what about oversight? What about committees? What about proper authorization procedure?" The human's response would later be studied by xenopsychologists across the galaxy as a perfect example of the fundamental difference between human and galactic thinking. She shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey the entire history of human adaptation, in cheerful disregard for authority, and said, "Sir, if I waited for authorization to solve problems, the problems would solve themselves by killing everyone while we were still filling out the paperwork." The silence that followed this statement was the sound of several civilizations simultaneously questioning everything they had ever believed about the proper relationship between rules and reality. What happened next would be studied in military academies, business schools, and psychiatric institutions across the galaxy for centuries to come. The Great Human Improvisation Crisis, as historians would later call it, marked the precise moment when the Galactic Security Federation discovered that efficiency and bureaucracy were not, as previously believed, synonymous concepts. The first sign of the coming revolution occurred 12 hours after the Fleet Command Council session, when Admiral Tenthrax did something unprecedented in galactic military history. He issued a direct order, without consulting the Order Authorization Review Board. The order was elegantly simple and terrifyingly practical. All human personnel are temporarily authorized to continue their current practices pending further review. This decision sent shockwaves through the administrative zealots' homeworld, where emergency therapy sessions were hastily organized for bureaucrats suffering from acute procedural displacement syndrome. The punctual cephalopods declared a state of temporal emergency, claiming that unauthorized efficiency violated the natural flow of bureaucratic time. The Meticulous Planning Confederation called for an immediate investigation into whether Admiral Tenthrax had been replaced by a human infiltrator. Meanwhile, aboard the GSF pinnacle of administrative excellence, the human engineer was experiencing what could charitably be described as the most bizarre day of her career. She had become quite unexpectedly the center of a galaxy-wide philosophical debate about the nature of authority, responsibility, and the proper storage of thermal grenades. Commander Yaxis approached her with the careful demeanor of someone handling exotic and potentially explosive, intellectual concepts. "Engineer," he said, "Fleet Command would like to implement your methods, on a trial basis. The human looked up from where she was demonstrating to Ensign Gleep how the thermal grenade could be safely secured using standard maintenance equipment, rather than the aesthetically balanced but functionally useless mounting systems provided by regulation. Your approach to problem solving, your disregard for, your creative interpretation of established procedures. You want me to keep fixing things? The simplicity of the question nearly caused Commander Yaxis to molt prematurely. Yes, but we need to understand how to systematize your approach. This request led to perhaps the most surreal meeting in galactic military history. The human engineer, accompanied by her faithful thermal grenade, found herself addressing a council of the galaxy's most distinguished military minds, explaining concepts that their species had spent millennia evolving specifically to avoid. The first principle, she said, holding up the grenade as a visual aid, is that rules exist to solve problems, not to create them. When a rule creates more problems than it solves, the rule is broken, not the situation. Several species required emergency cognitive adjustment procedures to process this concept. The Rigid Spine Collective had built their entire civilization on the principle that rules were sacred and immutable. The suggestion that rules could be evaluated based on their practical effectiveness was like suggesting that mathematics was optional, or that gravity was a matter of personal opinion. The second principle, the human continued, apparently oblivious to the philosophical carnage she was wreaking, is that the best solution is usually the one that works, not the one that looks good on paper. This statement caused the representative from the perfectionist collective to experience what his species called aesthetic system failure, a condition roughly equivalent to a nervous breakdown but with more concern for visual harmony. The third principle is that waiting for permission to solve urgent problems is often more dangerous than solving the problems without permission. The administrative zealot's representative began hyperventilating, which in his species involved 17 different breathing orifices working in panicked coordination. The concept of acting without authorization was so fundamentally alien to his worldview that his brain was attempting to process it as a form of advanced mathematics. But perhaps the most remarkable development was not the aliens' reactions to human efficiency, but their gradual, reluctant, and absolutely terrified acceptance of it. Within 72 hours of the human engineer's presentation, reports began flooding in from across the fleet. Ships were completing missions in record time. Maintenance schedules that had previously required months of committee approval were being resolved in hours. Emergency responses that had once involved 17 levels of authorization were now happening fast enough to actually address the emergencies they were meant to address. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Bex, inspired by the human's example, made an unauthorized decision to reroute power during a reactor fluctuation, without waiting for the Energy Distribution Committee to convene. The decision prevented a catastrophic failure that would have left the ship stranded in space for approximately 6 months while rescue authorization was processed through proper channels. "I just did what needed doing," she explained to a hastily assembled inquiry board, unconsciously echoing the human's philosophy. It seemed obvious. The word obvious began appearing with alarming frequency in official reports throughout the fleet. Crew members started making decisions based on immediate circumstances, rather than consulting comprehensive databases of pre-approved responses. Engineers began fixing problems when they found them, rather than filing reports about problems they had found. Medical officers started treating patients based on medical necessity, rather than waiting for the Medical Ethics Verification Board to approve each procedure. The bureaucratic infrastructure of the galaxy watched in horror as centuries of carefully constructed, procedural complexity began collapsing under the weight of simple, practical effectiveness. The final transformation came when the human engineer's thermal grenade finally found its proper place, not in the aesthetically balanced but functionally useless armory, but in a newly created storage system designed by practical necessity, rather than mathematical beauty. The new system could accommodate varying quantities of equipment, could be easily reconfigured for different missions, and could be accessed quickly during emergencies. It was, by Zephyrian standards, hideously ugly. It was also, by any practical measure,
vastly superior to the original design. Commander Yaxis stood in the reconfigured armory, watching his crew efficiently prepare for their next mission, with a speed and competence that would have been impossible under the old system. The human engineer was there too, toolkit in hand, no longer carrying her thermal grenade companion, but somehow still radiating that peculiar human confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. "Engineer," he said, "I have a confession to make. Yes, when you first joined this crew, I was terrified that human unpredictability would destroy everything we had built." The human smiled with that particularly human expression that somehow managed to be both humble and supremely confident. And now Commander Yaxis looked around at his efficiently functioning ship, his competent crew, and his armory that actually served its intended purpose. He thought about the galaxy-wide revolution in practical thinking that had started with one human and one thermal grenade. He considered the fact that his ship was now completing missions with unprecedented success while following regulations that actually made sense. "Now," he said, his throat clicking, taking on an entirely new harmonic pattern, "I'm terrified that we ever functioned without you." And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic heart of galactic civilization, a few more forms were quietly deleted, a few more committees were gently disbanded, and a few more problems were solved by the radical expedient of actually solving them. The galaxy would never be quite the same again, and everyone agreed that this was probably for the best, even if nobody wanted to admit it out loud. After all, that would require filing the proper paperwork.